As the renowned author Douglas Rushkoff points out, humans are biologically wired for empathy, social connection, and shared meaning. In other words, evolution designed us to find ourselves through each other. Yet today, we're grappling with global crises, information overload, and systems so vast they're hard to see. And within those systems, the world's most powerful corporations, governments, and elites have too often shown us the worst side of human nature. As our world grows more diverse and complex, it seems that our natural desire for unity begins to crack when we start challenging our assumptions and the narratives that shape our identities and lives. We're here to name the forces in media and politics that are actively sabotaging our sense of unity and reality itself. Yet we always take it further, exploring real-life examples, solutions, and stories of people all over the world, courageous enough to move beyond fear, division, and beliefs that the world is filled with doom and gloom. Despite all the gifts that technology has brought to our lives, our hyper-connected digital world has left us more alone, isolated, and afraid of each other. Over time, physical gathering places have disappeared from our communities, leaving us with fewer in-person social connections. Today, many of us spend most of our time maintaining our connections through a screen. Alexandra Hudson observed in her book, The Soul of Civility, that as community and family have declined in society, more and more people have found their ultimate meaning in political issues. Now it's easy for people to feel like their very identity is being assaulted because of that disagreement. If people are constantly being thrown into fight or flight mode, we're not doing democracy well. We're not doing life together very well. We take one aspect of who a person is and extrapolate that. That's all I need to know about who you are and what you stand for. But that's so reductive, and it's degrading to the dignity of every human person. When labels about each other dominate the media and everyday conversations, we end up knowing less about each other, but assuming we know more. We may feel certain that we understand each other, but is this certainty warranted? Political polarization has driven some 40% of Americans to self-censor rather than risk speaking out. Another poll found that 71% of people say political correctness has shut down important conversations, and over half are afraid to even share their political views. Doctors, scientists, historians, and scholars are increasingly self-censoring due to fears of public backlash, reputational damage, and online harassment. While an NBC News poll found that both parties believe the other will destroy America, research shows that Americans vastly overestimate how extreme those with opposing views actually are. Studies also show that both sides vastly overestimate how immoral the other side is, and how willing they are to subvert democracy. A self-fulfilling prophecy then unfolds when our fears about the other side become the justification for our own extreme behavior. Regardless of our political affiliations, these studies emphasize that most of us strongly share a specific moral concern: protecting the vulnerable from harm. Yet notice how this shared value isn't often emphasized in the media, nor centered in our everyday conversations. One of my favorite sayings is that it's not our differences that divide us. It's the judgment about our differences. And I can attest to this. I did restorative justice work in the public school systems for years, mediating hundreds of conflicts involving adults and kids who never thought they'd be in the same room together, and convening circles that brought different people together to address some of the hardest and most taboo issues facing the community. This work showed me just how rare it is for us to truly talk to one another, and yet how profound it can be when we courageously set aside our assumptions, open our minds and hearts together, and walk away transformed by insights and perspectives we hadn't considered before. Perception is an act of creation. We've got this brain that's designed to rewire itself with conscious thought. That means we're capable of seeing the world in new ways. Those beliefs might still guide us, but they don't have to confine us. The US is actually one of the few democracies in the world where political life is dominated by just two parties. Most advanced democracies have multi-party systems, more voices, more coalitions, and more ideologies that coexist with one another. But here, everything gets flattened into red versus blue, and it distorts how we see the world. One example is ground news, which promises to help people fact-check stories and spot media bias by categorizing news into partisan boxes. While ground news claims to help people see every side of a news story, it actually directs people away from the content of the news by assigning partisan labels to every story. People are instead nudged to ask, whose side is this on? Genuine media literacy involves more than sorting news into partisan boxes. When vaccine safety is framed as right-wing and racial justice as left-wing, there's no room for nuance. Body autonomy, election integrity, media accountability, freedom of expression, justice for sexual abusers at high levels of power, and concern over the growing influence of unelected power. Too often, we defend these values when it reinforces our views, but we ignore, discredit, or ridicule those values when they don't. This isn't about being neutral. It's about questioning the integrity of a system that feeds us pre-packaged talking points.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Builds emotional identity around them, and starves us of real knowledge. Independent local news outlets are disappearing. Paywalls are limiting access to news, and censorship narrows what's acceptable to say. Media narratives funnel us into false binaries, making it seem that there are only a few ways to think about complex issues, and that it's inappropriate to consider new or different perspectives. Once we realize this binary is a construct and not a truth, we can start to imagine something different. Imagine a political culture grounded in everyday needs and experiences. In restorative justice, key stakeholders, people who are affected by the issue, come together to hear all the voices, speak honestly, and begin the work of repair and healing. What if we approached controversial issues the same way? Take something like antidepressants or vaccines. Let's invite all voices to participate. Patients, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, those who've benefited and those who've been harmed. Every perspective would be heard and accounted for, and every bias named and understood in context. True dialogue is more than just humanizing each other. It's about having the courage to think deeper together about what's genuinely real and trustworthy. As someone who found my voice and activism within the social justice and DEI world, I eventually came to realize that I was operating in this ideological bubble, surrounded by people who consume the same narratives and rarely question their own assumptions. I realized that if my worldview is so fragile that I can't listen or make space for new or different views, then maybe that's where the real change in me needed to start. So I went to Trump rallies, and I saw how MAGA was actually this total melting pot of right-wing activists, former Democrats, loving mothers, working-class people of all races, and anti-establishment people who are done with the business as usual perpetuated by both political establishments. Sure, there were a small number of Christian extremists, yet none of them seemed to have a problem with me when I would challenge their views, and they would challenge mine. I also attended vaccine safety conferences, only to find some of the most intelligent, non-polarizing minds in science and medicine. All along the way, I constantly confused people because I couldn't be boxed as left or right, and I know I'm not alone. I'm part of a growing movement of courageous people looking beyond identity politics to make sense of the world directly together. The more time I spent in different spaces, talking to the people I was told to fear, listening to views I was told were dangerous, the more I saw just how deeply we're divided not by reality, but by narrative. Perhaps a greater threat to society is the misrepresentation of extremism in the media to make people afraid of each other and therefore easier to manipulate. Much of the societal noise dominating our conversations is generated by a media machine designed to discourage viewpoint diversity. This machine presents us with the illusion of consensus about the official story, while at the same time promoting the illusion of division by amplifying extremes on both ends. Mainstream media, concentrated in the hands of a few corporations with deep ties to government and industry, rarely interrogates the root causes or connects the dots beyond party lines. Our whole system is designed to protect and enrich the very figureheads and elites the media keeps us fixated on. Who controls our money supply? Who decides what stories of wrongdoing get buried and what gets amplified? Why are big food and the agricultural industry allowed to continue destroying our health and planet? And who are the forces blackmailing, surveilling, and effectively compromising our elected leaders and policymakers? I'd want to know we've created a public database of over 13,000 news article summaries on these deeper forces, drawing from the best of the corporate and independent media landscape. Our emphasis on verifiable and credible sources have become the exception, not the rule. We've entered an era where people build entire social media platforms by reacting to clips of politicians, protests, other content creators, or controversial moments stripped from the original context. High emotions trigger a rush of adrenaline and dopamine, the same chemicals involved in addiction. When we scroll through social media or consume news that confirms our anger or fear, or if it's loaded with a sense of urgency and existential threat, we're getting intense hits of emotional intensity that can often cloud our critical thinking. Over time, we become addicted not just to the information, but to the feeling it gives us, the certainty, the righteousness, the identity it reinforces. Our echo chambers create an artificial environment where different views are literally invisible and dialogue is reduced to unpunctuated sentence fragments on a screen. Our anger and rage can obviously be powerful tools for awakening and calling out injustice. Yet when content engineered for emotional reaction dominates the media ecosystem, it starts to replace any real or more subtle understanding of the deeper forces driving today's chaos. In this spirit, I think January 6th is a fascinating opportunity to start a deeper conversation on an issue that's been quite controversial and pretty loaded to talk about these days. Yes, tragic violence and criminal activity happened that day. Some call this an orchestrated and violent coup attempt that threatened democracy, while others see this as a political demonstration that spun out of control. However you see it, leading up to January 6, Trump spread inflammatory rhetoric and pressured officials, but his actions did not involve a coordinated military or institutional takeover, and his actions were repeatedly blocked by his own appointees, courts, and state officials. Fake elector slates were submitted by fringe elements in 7 states, but that had no impact on the election outcome. Even the New York Times reported that despite 500,000 encrypted messages collected by law enforcement, there was no clear evidence of premeditated coordination with the Proud Boys. In fact, a senior law enforcement official emphasized that the majority of those arrested acted independently, driven more by grievances against the political establishment. Meanwhile, the media barely amplified the court documents that identified up to 8 Proud Boys leaders as FBI informants. Given that the actual leader of the Proud Boys was an FBI informant, did federal agencies let the chaos unfold that day, or use it as a way to justify crackdowns on dissent? Government informants have historically been used not just to gather intelligence, but to guide, provoke, and even arm the groups they infiltrate. In terrorism sting operations, informants have encouraged or orchestrated plots to entrap people, even teenagers with development issues. These tactics misrepresent the threat of terrorism to justify huge budgets and to inflate arrest and prosecution statistics for PR purposes. When violence erupts, it provides the perfect excuse for public fear, surveillance expansion, and narrative control. Yes, many of the January 6 participants carried weapons and acted violently, and that should be taken seriously. But it's got me thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests that I was a part of. Even as the vast majority of participants were peaceful, violent acts also occurred during those protests. Thousands of protesters watched as a Minneapolis police station burned to the ground, and thousands of businesses were destroyed in cities nationwide. Media coverage largely emphasized the deep pain in the social justice communities driving the need to protest, and rightfully distinguished nonviolent protesters from the opportunists and looters. But for those at the Capitol on January 6, the narrative was simplified. The police were peaceful, the protesters were egregious terrorists. And while many committed serious crimes, the majority of the people on January 6 were nonviolent. Any recognition of pain or systemic grievance was totally stripped away. There will always be opportunists who exploit political pivotal moments, painting one movement as heroes seeking justice and the other as irredeemable extremists doesn't help us heal, and it only deepens the divide. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges said it best: "There is little that unites me with those who occupied the Capitol building on January 6, but the vast majority of those caught up in the incursion of the Capitol did not commit serious crimes, engage in violence, or know what they would do in Washington other than protest the election results. We are exacerbating the growing tribalism and political antagonisms that will increasingly express themselves through violence." If we're going to defend democracy, we need to do so with consistency, not with selective outrage. We can all agree that what happened before or on January 6 did not change the outcome of the 2020 election. On the contrary, far more consequential abuses of power during past election cycles received significantly less media coverage. George Bush became president after a Supreme Court decision following the wrongful purge of tens of thousands of mostly Black, Hispanic, and low-income voters in Florida. Governor Jeb Bush and Secretary of State Katherine Harris had hired a private data firm to carry out the purge. In 2016, leaked emails revealed that the DNC rigged its primary to favor Hillary Clinton, colluding with major media to smear and disfavor Bernie Sanders, who was catalyzing an unprecedented populist movement to reform the economic system controlling the wealth of our country. To deflect attention from these revealing email leaks, Clinton's team helped manufacture the Russia collusion narrative by funding the Steele dossier through a law and opposition research firm called Fusion GPS. This dossier was passed to the media and the FBI at the same time. High-ranking officials within the FBI and CIA were briefed on the Clinton campaign strategy to stir up a scandal, tying Trump to Russia before any credible evidence or inquiry existed. Instead of amplifying in the media these backdoor political manipulations, major news outlets ran thousands of speculative stories and claims by unnamed experts that implied guilt and silenced dissent. When both the Mueller and Durham reports uncovered no evidence of collusion 2 years later, very few outlets retracted or corrected their reporting. As veteran NPR reporter Yuri Berliner reflected, "It is one thing to swing and miss on a major story. What's worse is to pretend it never happened, to move on with no mea culpa, no self-reflection, especially when you expect high standards of transparency from public figures and institutions, but don't practice those standards yourself. That's what shatters trust about the media." The very institutions we've trusted to uphold the values our nation was founded on have evidently been undermining democracy directly. We've all seen how Trump has leveraged institutional power to challenge media coverage he views as unfavorable and silence dissent on university campuses. AI tools were recently deployed to automate a DEI purge across federal agencies. Compliance teams were dispatched to enforce their version of ideological conformity. Efforts to control our words and thoughts can be aggressive and overt, though they often operate more quietly through bureaucratic institutional channels like academic research grants and so-called disinformation and fact-checking partnerships. Yet they all serve to shape our perception without our consent, suppress dissent, and protect the interests of those in power, even when that means covering up wrongdoing. Two of the most revealing disclosures came from the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, or CEDL, whistleblower files, and the Twitter files, which exposed how federal agencies, military intelligence contractors, big tech platforms, and NGOs coordinated to influence and suppress online speech, especially on contentious issues like COVID, elections, war, and Russiagate, which I mentioned earlier. Interestingly enough, these whistleblower revelations suggested that a leading motivation for the CEDL counter-disinformation project was to, quote, stop a repeat of 2016 in defense of Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, and other figures implicated in the email leaks. As we've seen, many censored views turned out to be true, or at least worthy of investigation. Take the COVID lab leak theory. Initially labeled as a dangerous conspiracy theory, it was aggressively censored across platforms, flagged by fact-checkers, dismissed by media gatekeepers, and public discourse was poisoned as we turned against each other, labeling each other as conspiracy theorists. Only for US agencies to now favor the lab leak as the likely origin of COVID. Censorship often backfires, as explained with the Streisand effect, where attempts to suppress information actually draw more attention to it. In the growing infrastructure of what people now call the censorship industrial complex, taxpayer money funds research that builds tools to limit what taxpayers are allowed to say or see. Mark Zuckerberg publicly admitted that big tech became an informal arm of the Biden administration, and that Facebook, now Meta, censored true information, or even satire or jokes based on political agendas, not objective truth. Internal Slack messages and emails between Twitter staff show that executives there debated whether flagged posts violated rules and concluded that many did not. Instead of allowing people to think and debate for themselves, CEDL and Twitter files operatives pressured social media companies to throttle or ban stories. Some of their tactics involved co-opting hashtags, infiltrating private invite-only groups, cutting off bank access to those who organize rallies, and creating sock puppet accounts, fake online identities used to manipulate discussions or create the illusion of widespread support or opposition, all covertly shaping public opinion. Following COVID, federal agencies poured hundreds of millions of dollars into misinformation research. AI tools were developed and used to detect and censor so-called malinformation, which is accurate information that is deemed as harmful. So that means you can post something that's completely true, but if it causes people to question government policy or official messaging, it might still be taken down. Universities are now in a deepfake AI race to develop technologies for the Pentagon that can generate fake online personas indistinguishable from real humans. This isn't new. It's part of a well-documented pattern in which US military and intelligence agencies have manipulated social media ecosystems for narrative control. So before we turn against each other, we might want to ask, who actually benefits from sowing division and creating information chaos? Who are the real purveyors of misinformation? It's worth remembering the striking words of two former CIA directors. The Central Intelligence Agency owns everyone of any significance in the major media. We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false. Powerful industries have also manufactured scientific consensus and distorted public discourse. A company called Vfluence, funded by USAID and the USDA, secretly tracked and profiled over 500 scientists, environmental activists, journalists, and food safety advocates, many of whom oppose genetically modified foods and pesticides, and were calling attention to the millions of pounds of chemicals sprayed on our food each year across the US. Agrochemical companies have faced over 160,000 lawsuits in the US, linking their products to environmental destruction, cancer, brain diseases, and other rampant, deadly health problems, making it one of the largest corporate liability issues in modern history. The Vfluence dossiers included private addresses, family details, and derogatory commentary with the goal to threaten and neutralize critics with surveillance and reputational smears. Members of this portal included over 1,000 USDA policymakers, State Department officials, agrochemical executives, and lobbyists, all working to protect corporate agricultural interests. Monsanto, facing growing scrutiny over its glyphosate-based pesticide Roundup, spent millions creating a network of fake experts, ghostwritten science, and media influence to discredit critics and mislead the public. Major universities, nonprofits, and media outlets were co-opted to lend credibility to the corporate propaganda. So trust the science sounds noble, until you realize that even top editors of world-renowned journals have warned that much of published medical or science research is unreliable, distorted by fraud, corporate influence, and conflicts of interest. At Want to Know, we believe that people are perfectly capable of finding the truth together when corporate and political interests stop interfering with the process. And most importantly, we believe that all of these media manipulations exploit something deeply human, our evolutionary wiring to protect ourselves and our community from danger. In today's media landscape, this ancient negativity bias is constantly triggered, flooding us with an endless barrage of character attacks and smears, existential worst-case scenarios, disasters, and who's to blame, which all contribute to a cycle of cynicism, apathy, and exhaustion.
Tensions boil over and come to blows.
You the one talking about,
I think your fake eyelashes are messing up.
No, ain't nothing.
Hold on.
Somebody's bleach blonde, bad built butch body, that would not be engaging in personalities, correct?
A what now?
In this distorted environment, we begin to internalize an artificial sense of scarcity, not just of resources, but of goodness, trust, and possibility. But this isn't the full picture. Just as our negativity bias has helped us to survive, we need to know what is going right and well in this world. Contrary to doom and gloom media narratives, planet Earth has abundant resources. We've got the resources and tech to solve most of our biggest problems, rebuild the commons, and reverse the damages of ecological destruction. Like the Taiwanese government officials who once worked with the decentralized civic tech community to address the increasing political division in their country. Their question was, how do we find a way not to measure division, but construct consensus? This question gave birth to a social media platform that hosted online spaces for debate, where comments that were consensus-oriented got the most visibility. And what they found was that within a few weeks, they could clearly identify where most people agree on many different issues. And this process created outcomes the government could actually act on. Dozens of laws have now been passed based on what they found through this process. As we grapple with what to trust and how to reclaim our individual and collective well-being during times of uncertainty, some truths can only be revealed through relationship. Like the social prescribing movement, a healthcare approach that recognizes that purpose, creativity, and social connection is just as important as pharmaceutical meds. Instead of just offering pills and asking what's wrong with you, care providers ask what matters to you. And then they connect people to non-clinical supports like art classes, cooking classes, buddy activities, music, nature walks, or otherwise known as green prescriptions, grief groups, or meaningful work in the community. Backed by neuroscience and international studies, social prescribing is now being adopted in over 20 countries, where people are literally healing pain, depression, and chronic disease without medication. For over 30 years, Seeds of Peace has brought together over 8,000 young people from war zones and divided communities all over the world. At this summer camp, they engage in structured, face-to-face dialogue and engage in physical challenges together like trust exercises and ropes courses. Some of these teens have the opportunity to engage in dialogue with peers from countries they're told to fear. And some of these countries they're legally banned from visiting. At Seeds of Peace, the goal of dialogue isn't to agree, but to increase the capacity to hold complex truths and redefine the sides altogether. Some of these quotes from the youth are so touching. There is a culture that seems to be growing in the US of needing a safe space and being triggered very easily. If you're not able to engage someone that you disagree with, how are you going to grow? You have to challenge yourself from different directions in order to know that your opinion stands. The wish to not have to deal with the other is an illusion, and I hope this realization becomes a source of strength rather than weakness. That inevitably, we have to find a way to make this work for all of us. Otherwise, it will work for none of us. We've got thousands of stories in our inspirational news archive that serve to remind us we are not as divided as we think, and that we've got the tools and the heart and the creativity to revive community and the greater good. Our lives are miraculous, and it's incredible that we're living on this planet hurtling through the cosmos. It's totally healthy and natural to fear things that threaten us, but modern culture has amplified this tendency. That fear can sometimes make us cling to what feels familiar, affirming, and what gives us a sense of control in a complex world. This video is a call to invite all of us, no matter who we vote for or what we believe in, to overcome any construct meant to divide and disempower us, to radically broaden our views, our social circles, and to move beyond fear, to bring our focus back to the collective values that are less about politics and more about tapping into our biological imperative to connect, cooperate, and co-create shared meaning. We can't shift the chaos we're in until we name it clearly. When we can recognize what's really pushing us in our personal lives and as a society, we already have a degree of freedom from it. Challenging information can paradoxically remind us of the greater good. It is the courage of the people and the love for the common good that bring these injustices to light, fueling open dialogue and constructive action. If this video resonated with you, please like, subscribe, comment, and share this work widely. Join us in being a part of a global team of loving, courageous people dedicated to transformation on this planet.